Good morning. We continue today with our journey through Isaiah, focusing on Isaiah chapter 52 and reading the first 12 verses. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For the uncircumcised and the unclean shall enter you no more. Shake yourself from the dust, rise up, O captive Jerusalem. Loose the bonds from your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money. For thus says the Lord God, long ago my people went down into Egypt, to reside there as aliens. The Assyrian too has oppressed them without cause. Now therefore, what am I doing here, says the Lord, seeing that my people are taken away without cause? Their rulers howl, says the Lord, and continually all day long my name is despised. Therefore my people shall know my name, and on that day they shall know that it is I who speak. It is I. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messengers who announce peace, who bring good news, who announce salvation, and say to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, you sentinels, lift up your voices. Together they shout, for in plain sight they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth, shout for joy, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of God. Depart, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of it, purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste, and you shall not go in flight, for the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The people of God, we know, had faced oppression. To some extent, they'd felt themselves to be separated from God for extended periods. They'd been enslaved in Egypt. They'd wandered in the desert, far from home, looking for the way to go, sometimes feeling themselves abandoned by God, being hungry and thirsty and sensing that God had forgotten them. It's perhaps inevitable that for some of them there must have been questions about how much God valued them, whether in fact he counted them as important enough to notice their suffering. In our passage today we hear Isaiah speaking to Zion, which was a name which was used to describe both the land of Israel and the people of the city of Jerusalem. We hear Isaiah calling on God's people to wake up, to loosen the bonds that were tying them down and shake off the dust of the desert. Isaiah went on to reassure the people of God that they were seen by God as worthy. I think that when we are at our lowest ebb, when life's circumstances seem to be holding us captive, when everything we try seems to land in failure and unhappiness, it's often that we find ourselves pondering whether we're less worthy than other people, whether God cares about how we're suffering and where we're at. The values of this world, are very, very different from God's values. All too often our value is judged in terms of what we earn, what we've got, where we live, who we know, the things we can do or not do, the things we succeed at and fail at. They aren't God's values. God doesn't care whether or not we're successful in worldly terms. God cares about whether we're loving, caring, compassionate, generous, honest, whether we acknowledge our need of his love and forgiveness, and in return love and forgive others. God sees us and knows us intimately. As Isaiah has taught us in earlier passages, he has known us from the moment of conception. He knows our worth because he had a hand in our creation. God will always see us very differently from people in the world around us. As a nation, as a world, at this moment in time, we're enduring all sorts of challenges and hardships. Many people will struggle this year to keep their houses warm. Families will struggle to feed their children. People may well lose their homes as debt spirals and they struggle to pay the bills. They're troubling times, and I fear that there truly will begin to be people within our society who think that they're seen as less worthy. They're seen as fodder for casting aside. They will be abandoned to sink or swim as they can, because so many are tied up in trying to keep themselves afloat. These people, all people, surely now more than ever, need to hear the words of Isaiah reassuring us all that God sees us as worthy and valuable. These people, all people now more than ever, need to hear the messengers of God speaking to them. Listen again to verse 7 from our reading. Isaiah speaks of the importance and the value of the messenger. He says, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news and announces salvation." In his time and his setting, it was Isaiah that was the messenger. It was he who spoke to people of God's love for them and reminded them that no matter how distant he felt, God was there. Today, you and I are called to be God's messengers, to speak of God's love, to demonstrate God's love in a hurting world. What might we find in Isaiah's message that impacts on our own lives, I wonder? Will what he says make any difference to the way that we live, the way that we see ourselves? Now more than ever, society, this country and other countries, need a compass point to govern the way that we live and interact. We need a compass point which will set the values that foster the common good and not just the devil take the hindmost. I wonder whether the challenges of this passage are whether we can see ourselves as messengers. Do we treat others in a way that develops their self-worth? Do we care about others in a practical fashion, perhaps checking in on our neighbours, perhaps doing practical tasks that they find difficult? Do we contribute regularly to charities as God lays them on our heart? Do we give generously to the food banks because we can't fail to see on the news day in and day out that the food banks are being used more and more and more, and yet they're getting less and less in? As we shop, can we add an extra item or 2 or 3 for the food bank? Can we remember that whilst we struggle, there are always others worse off than we are? When we see others the way that God sees them, then we can't help but to reach out in love and to serve with compassion so that others will know and find their own self-worth. In addition, if we find the courage to speak of our faith to those that God sends to us, not stridently, not in complicated churchy language, but just gently, if we are open about our need of faith and the comfort and the strength that we find in it, then others will come to know about the loving God who reassured the people of Israel. The final thought today, though, must go back to Isaiah, because he bids the messengers of God to touch no unclean thing. to purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of God. Is it a challenge from God to us to take an honest look at the way that we live our lives? To look at where we put our values, the attitudes we express or simply condone? And as we reflect, is there a sense that God may be asking us to purify ourselves, to lay aside things that might be unworthy of us as children of God? We are called to be vessels of the Lord, messengers of the Lord. But first we are called to purify ourselves, to go in God's strength and not our own. And finally, well, today's passage finishes with words of reassurance. We may be fearful of sharing faith, but Isaiah said, the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. With God on our side, opening the doors and standing behind us, we can't fail but to share his love if we listen and serve faithfully. There is much in this passage to reassure. There is much to ponder on. And as we do it, I wish each and every one of you a very